In this episode, we are hosting Tyler Hansen, the CTO of Zetta. We're going to explore how modern data infrastructure is evolving. Welcome on the pod.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, great to have you, Tyler. So let's just start off with the elevator pitch of what Zeta does.
So the way I usually describe it is Zetta is an automated business intelligence platform. So think of Tableau, Power BIs of the world. What we do is we take that sort of business intelligence workflow that you're used to doing, and we automate a lot of the making of charts and reports and individual dashboards. Instead, what you do is you go into Zetta, you define your metrics, which are the things that really matter. That's what you control. And then a lot of the reports, the dashboards, the charts, those are automatically generated and you can explore those. You don't have to fiddle with those because if you know analytics, you know that analysts spend a lot of time just digging into messing around with those reports and it's not a really great use of their time. So we're trying to hopefully cut down on that by a lot.
Yeah, streamlining the outcomes of what people are looking to get with data, essentially.
Absolutely. A lot of times with analytics teams, you spend a lot of time doing those sorts of things and not actually doing analytics and analyzing data and making better decisions. So hopefully we can break through that barrier.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I'm excited to see what the product looks like. So why did you start the company and what has been the story of it since its beginnings a year and a half ago?
Yeah, so I started this with another business partner who we used to work in data. We've both been working in data for a long time. And I think the decision to start the company really came from our experience seeing how much of a mess business intelligence analytics can be. We know what's effective. We've both been able to implement really lean, effective practices. When we were catching up one day and we just said, you know what, like you should be able to automate a lot of the really boring grunt work and kind of help people not fall into those traps that we see them falling into. And a classic sort of company starting scenario, we didn't know quite exactly what we wanted to do. We just knew there was something we could automate. The more we talked to people, the more we talked to prospective clients. We were looking at the entire data stack and we've done some work on kind of end-to-end data integration, but we realized the focus is really on these business intelligence workflows. And so we have a lot of tools, but we've really been focusing on the BI end since last year and rolled that out a couple of months ago as kind of like the version 2 of our product. And yeah, just again, to sum it up, like we've seen the mess. This is this is the BI tool, at least speaking for myself, that I always wish I had to kind of fix that because I can do what Zetta does with Tableau if I'm really disciplined and I'm willing to go through the same workflows over and over again. But now with Zetta, it's all embedded in the platform. It's all that much faster. And that kind of sums it up, I think.
What type of customers are you seeing kind of being your ICP? Is it mid-market customers? Is it SMB, enterprise? What are you seeing?
It's definitely on the smaller side, newer startups, or maybe mid-market. I would see there's sort of two profiles that are interested in Zetta. One is companies that have no analytics infrastructure. They have nothing. They're just getting started. And it's really a clean slate where they're able to come in and say, hey, what's new on the market? Those are companies that we're able to come in with kind of our services arm and say, hey, we'll actually get a data warehouse configured for you. We'll get you ready from day zero to be using Zetta or any other tool, honestly. But those are the blank slate companies. That's a pretty narrow segment, to be honest, because a lot of companies, if they're that early, they're like, well, I don't really need data. Excel is fine. I'd love to go to all those companies and say, you're going to have a board meeting one of these quarters where you are screwed and you better get ahead of this problem. But for a lot of companies, they get to that board meeting, they panic, and then they decide to buy a data team, right? Past that point, you have a lot of companies that already have a data team. And that's kind of the second segment that we're going after that we've had a little bit of traction with is companies where you have like one data analyst. And that's where I think our value is really compelling is if you have like one analyst who's struggling to hold it all together, the way budgets are now, companies are laying people off. This is a tool that can really multiply the efforts of that one or two people to not have them spending all their time chasing down these reports, chasing down discrepancies. They can really centralize their efforts. And so that's where we've been successful as well is, hey, I'm the one analyst. Here's my control panel where I can deal with everything and I can do the work of three analysts.
Everyone's expected to do the work of three people, so you need platforms to fill the gaps there. Is the main competition that you're going up against, it sounds like status quo, like either we don't need this platform yet, or like Tableau is working for us for now, or what are you seeing there?
Competition is coming from the big platform, the incumbents, the Tableaus, the Power BIs, the Lookers. It's tough. And I think that's one of the advantages. We're a bootstrap company. We don't have to topple the giants. We just have to find our niche. But I also think there's a lot of competition these days as there's more consolidation in the data space where it's like, oh, Snowflake has built in charts. Why do I need to bother? Oh, I'll use whatever Google or Amazon has. Google Data Studio, it's horrible, but it's free, right? So that can be tough to compete with as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, and you're seeing that more and more of like, this is easy to do, but it's really not easy to do.
It's not easy to do well, right? It's exactly it.
Yeah, I personally always find this. It's easy to start something. It's much harder to finish something.
Right. And that's the thing I've seen. I do a lot of freelance consulting, or we see companies where they bring in their software engineers to kind of do their V0 of their analytics infrastructure and unwinding that because they make a lot of mistakes. They make a lot of decisions that are not ideal, that are not scalable. Often what I find myself called in to do is to help unwind kind of the first version.
I think there's also a problem of defining what analytics really means in a company. For the long
Right.
time, data science or data analysts were essentially pulling data with SQL and putting everything in the Power BI. I get it as part of the job, but that's not the job, right? Like it's really much more that you have to deliver on top, especially now when a lot of that stuff is getting automated, right? So
Eventually.
yeah,
I think you could probably automate at the level that the analysts have been doing it, but can you automate it at the level that it should be at, right? But to your point, that then invalidates, those efforts that are being made that are a little bit ad hoc, right? It kind of proves the value of having really thoughtful analytics.
yeah, and I think that's where everything is going. I think the analysts, what I'm trying to say is that the analysts will need to elevate their game. But speaking about these use cases, just curious to see the demo of your product. So, what is your core use case you want to share with the audience?
I'll just show the basic metric workflow that we have in Zetta and kind of walk through, if you were an analyst, how you would be using it. My screen is up now. This is what you see when you first log into Zetta. It's really a step-by-step guide to using the platform. So if you've used like a BI tool before, you're probably pretty familiar with the workflow around adding like a connection to a warehouse. We support all pretty common like Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, even some SQL databases. Let's say, if you're using, let's say BigQuery, you would type in your credentials here, create a connection. Great. Now Zetta can query your data in BigQuery. So that's the first step. Now we get into actually adding metrics. This is actually the core of Zetta. So when we say like it's automated business intelligence, you're not going to spend time making charts. We have some dashboard customization that I'll touch on, but for the most part, what you want to manage here is these metrics. And I have a whole ton of them because this is a demo account. But basically, you created a connection to your data warehouse or your database. Now you're saying, what does a metric mean? And if you're an analyst, this is the world that you live in, right? Someone say, give me a chart of signups, give me a chart of active users. You have to kind of interpret and understand what do those things mean. And the whole idea with Zetta is that actually that's all the work you're going to be doing in the platform is going in explicitly saying, this is what signups means. And every time signups shows up in a dashboard, it's going to reference the same metric. Here, it's not going to reference some ad hoc chunk of SQL. It's not going to reference some specific configuration. So it's a bit of a two-step process. So like the first thing you do is you basically say, okay, what table is my data coming from? So if I've connected a warehouse here, you can see a bunch of different tables that are available. You can put descriptions right in here, which is really awesome. How many times as an analyst are you in a dashboard and someone says, hey, what does this mean? What does signups mean, right? You can actually put a description that'll show up on the dashboard. And then once you define a table where data is coming from, that's where you actually can start punching in the metrics. And so metrics are pretty simple. Like signups might be the count of users in a users table, right? Again, you can put in a description. You can do some additional format, how it shows up in reports. But for the most part, there's some more complicated stuff you can do with metrics, snapshotting, filters, all of that. But a lot of your metrics are going to be really simple. And then as an analyst, you're also familiar with dimensions. So when I have a metric Am I filtering it? Am I breaking it down? Am I grouping it? That's what the dimensions are for as well. The same type of model where you basically point to a column or an expression in your table and you give it a definition so that you know what it means when you're on the dashboard. So that's kind of the boring part. That's like the work that you actually have to do. And then what you actually end up getting from all of that is the automated dashboards will start to generate. So here, like if I go to the automated dashboard in this demo account, all those data models show up as tabs, and then you can start navigating the metrics. This happens right away. You don't have to build this dashboard. You can start navigating the different metrics that you defined. You can add breakdown dimensions. Those descriptions pop up in tooltips. It basically just looks like a nice dashboard that you would make. This is based on, from my experience, the same dashboard I was making over and over again for every use case at every company I've consulted with or worked for. So why keep building that when it's a pretty standard setup? And then the last thing to show here on the dashboard is once you've added all those descriptions, it's actually pretty easy to say, ask a question with plain text and just parse that out and not even have to use the filters and the controls at all. So maybe show me signups from the US over the last 6 months by day. It's actually going to just populate all those filters. I love this feature because I make really sophisticated dashboards sometimes, and end users are like, I don't want to have to click on filters. I don't want to have to navigate all this stuff. And they basically end up asking an analyst a question and expecting them to go and do all the filters for them. Now I'd say, hey, paste the question into this box here because we have the technology to kind of not have to do that anymore.
This is like an end business user like me dream. I'm like, I just want to understand this very specific slice of data, but now I'm cross-referencing this dashboard with this dashboard and trying to figure out what the answer is. So that's a great feature.
And when you talk about like cross-referencing dashboards, the idea here is you define that metric once it already pops up here in this automated dashboard. We have the ability to generate custom dashboards where you can arrange things differently, but it's still going to reference the same metric definition. It's not like you're creating it from whole cloth, a different metric that you then have to compare and wonder why it's not the same. And then a couple of other features around that as well. One thing, I love this. You can do this in Tableau. So of course we had to do it as well. Like you can copy a link that will drop you right into this configuration. So like by day with signups in the US, that's huge because a lot of times as an analyst, one of my pet peeves is someone will be like, oh, make me a new dashboard with all these different configurations. And I'll say, well, we have an existing dashboard. And if you just click on these filters, you'll get what you want. I'm not going to make a new one and have to manage that as an additional piece of content. The good news is I can just copy this link for you, put it in your bookmarks, do whatever you want with it. But now you have it's the same dashboard, but you can go right to what you actually want to see every time.
So that's very interesting. So you have the system is saving versions based on my queries or descriptions that I'm typing in as well.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of a distinction there. The share link is just popping in a URL parameter. So if you actually follow this link, there's a whole encoded bit here that then gets parsed when you load the page. But you can also save it as a bookmark, which is a nice feature. So obviously, like if you were on the sales team and you had like a specific you would really like to look at, you don't want to have to paste that link into your bookmarks or a document somewhere. You can actually save a bookmark, and then we have this feature called My Dashboard where the bookmarks will pop up.
I think there's a lot of benefits here. So the one is to set it up. That boring thing is saving you a ton of time
I think it's boring in the context of the demo. This is an analyst workflow, right?
Exactly.
It's just very distilled.
Yeah, there's a process to set up these things. And anyone who was in the metric space or was ever trying to assemble something that was a definition knows how difficult it is to have these iterations with the leaders and the teams. Everyone has their own idea, how to set it up. So that's almost a kind of immediate win on the data team. The other users I can see here that they also benefit greatly with the clarity that they're getting,
Right.
and the fast pace of these adjustments that you mentioned, right? Like, hey, how about this version or that version? I hate this question, because we know that There's a moment when you gather the information and somebody's telling you, I need this dashboard, that dashboard, this to show me this. And then suddenly, somebody realized, oh, I need the 5 more dimensions to drill this
Right.
down because I don't see the answer, right? Well, I've been on the both sides, to be frank. The truth is that it takes a lot of time because you got to go back, you got to bring these fields, you got to maybe add the columns, and because you didn't have them, that's pain, what. So I see the benefit here that is just saving a ton of time and those bookmarks, right? Like, because it's a great feature that can save these versions as people evolving with their mindset and hey, this is that and this. So what are the metrics, so critical metrics that to monitor this system, right? To assess the effectiveness of your solution and maybe some other comparable tools on the market, right? Because, when I buy the system, I'm always thinking, okay, there are some obvious benefits, but there are some hidden benefits as well. And what would you recommend to do to those that are trying or thinking about maybe bringing solutions like this to think about? Like, what are the criteria you would recommend them to look at?
It's a good question because this is the sort of thing we're obviously logging usage for us internally to figure out how our customers using it. For enterprise customers of Zetta, that's stuff that we can make available to them to look at their organization to do exactly what you're saying. Companies, they adopt a BI solution and they have like 3 or 4 power users, right? There's like, the one person who championed it, there's maybe a couple of people who really get it, and they're not seeing really that widespread frequent adoption. So this one's a little simple, but honestly, like, unique daily active users of the platform is huge. But then I think the other thing that's really top of mind for me is how often are people looking at the same dashboards across different teams? Because it's very easy, especially for a traditional BI tool, to basically have each team is siloed into their own analytics environment. They have their own dashboards that define metrics their own ways that don't overlap with other teams. And so they live in their own world, right? And that's kind of like when you look at like the Zetta automated dashboard, the Zetta homepage, we're trying to say all the teams should be looking at the same things, even if they're not always looking at the exact same metrics. There should be overlap so that they're living in the same world. And so a success metric for me is how many different people are looking at the same dashboards that overlap, because that tells me that they're living in a shared reality. They're not siloed out to different worlds.
Yeah, the amount of times that I'm sitting in a meeting and it's like, well, I pulled this information in Redash and I saw this information in Tableau, and this is what Salesforce is saying. And it's like, we can't even have a conversation about what's
Right.
actually happening because we're arguing about what data is right. And so, yeah, having
Or
that.
worse yet, you're not even arguing about it because it's their world. I guess it's right for them, but now I don't care and I don't have any reason to dispute it, right?
Yeah, and that's not my style. I'm gonna take it to the down in flames to get an answer. But yes, I think that happens a lot too. It's just like, oh, well, I guess we don't have this data and we move on from it. So that's it. That's a huge benefit. Obviously, you're hinting at this now, like you want to see more widespread adoption across all teams. What do you with the customers you have today, what have they noticed? Like have they seen like, oh, now marketing and sales can collaborate better and align on numbers, or what are some of the specific feedback you've heard from customers?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, the specific feedback we've gotten is, oh, I don't have to spend so much time hunting around. I can go to the homepage. I can see everything at a glance. We have these really good exec reports that show everything. You don't want people to have to go in and have to spend all this time pulling the numbers that they need. So I think that's been a big key piece of feedback, and it's pushed us to refining what do we show on our homepage? What do we make sure is in front of people so that they're seeing everything that's pertinent? They're seeing what they want to see, and how can we get even smarter about that is kind of what we're thinking about right now. And I think that's big for collaboration. I think because if everyone's having that same experience, it again prevents that siloing problem.
Yeah, it's almost like you could like set a role. Like, hey, I'm a marketer or demand gen marketer, and does that help you kind of figure out, is that how you're thinking about it? Or do you
I think it's a little bit of a balancing act, right? Because I think we're just about to roll out a feature to like favorite metrics. And there's a question of, is that at the user level? Is it at the team level? Is it both? So we want to kind of strike that balance between we're showing you things that are pertinent to you and your role versus we don't want to silo you into, well, now you're only seeing a subset of the metrics. Ideally, we would leave that in the hands of the end users, that they are using the metric definitions judiciously. They have a relatively constrained set of metrics so that that doesn't happen. To be honest, it's just something where we have to see the evolving usage and to figure out exactly what the best approach is going to be. You basically have it like, okay, here there was no store metrics, the whole company. Here's your team's metrics. You want people from each team to be paying attention to what's happening with other teams. And that's kind of what the North Stars are for. So I can see, like, if we set up Zetta in the right way, you'd have a really disciplined metric program, you'd be fine. But that's kind of the balance of giving the users lots of freedom versus saying, hey, Zetta is actually a tool that helps you conform to these practices. Like I said before, like I can set up a Tableau deployment that's like super well oiled, but the tool itself is not helping me do that. I'm actually working against the tool to do that, right? And we want Zetta to kind of work with you to have really good metrics practices. And that's sort of a work in progress, to be honest. Like we have the framework here. Like now we're thinking about, if a company uses Zetta for 2 years, how do we make sure it stays clean? How do we make sure that it keeps pushing them in the right direction? Those are things we haven't been around enough to answer yet. And I'm hoping that that we do learn a lot and we are able to do that.
Yeah, I think you're touching a couple of very interesting areas that are intriguing for me, and observing how the AI is really changing these applications. I see that the one big benefit is that these traditionally built and made application software, they are based off some repeatability, right? So something that is constantly repeating in the same way or same fashion or with a very little elasticity. Now, these new applications that are putting AI at the core of the solution, I think by virtue they becoming way more adjustable, right? They are more accommodating for larger audience of users, and they can interact with almost the same data depending on what the job is, right? So to your point that you made earlier, right? You want to enable the organization to decide who's the super user, who are these users, and to what extent they actually can define that range of interaction with the specific metrics. That is going very deep into the architecture of your platform. How do you approach that process is my question. I'm observing platforms like ThoughtSpot, and they are spending a lot of time focusing on architecture and ensuring that they understand the data. Their platform is actually focusing on understanding the data before they start spitting out anything on the metric side. So how are you approaching this from the architecture perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything comes down to our version of the semantic model. And data products, that's what they call this sort of metrics definition layer, right? And that's not AI, right? That's deterministic. You go in as the user and you type in what a metric means. And that's very intentional because a metric has to reflect intent. LLM is never going to do that for you. It's never going to tell you what to adhere to that's important to your business. It can suggest things, but it can't commit you to them. It can't have that intent, which is really the human element. We can, in the future, we can make it so that an LLM can look at your data warehouse and suggest what a metric could be. And you can say, yes, I like this suggestion, right? But you have to go in and say, we're committing to this metric as a North Star. We know what it means. We appreciate what it means, et cetera, right? So that's kind of the choke point here, where when you saw the metric builder before, that's a pretty simple interface. Well, it's complicated in terms of the number of things you have to punch in, but it's just a basic user interface where you're entering that information. It goes into Zetta's database. And then everything that we do is kind of leveraging that information to make sure that, hey, if we're generating charts, they're all based on those metrics. If we're generating insights, it's all based on those metrics. It's all based on, Zetta's libraries that use those metrics. And so from a technical perspective, like we have sort of two sides to our architecture. There's the real-time side, which is serving the dashboards. So that's when you go in and you set those filters or you ask a question. It's taking that, it's parsing out what metrics, what dimensions. It's translating that into a query that then gets executed on your warehouse and then returns the data. That's all happening in real time. again, it's looking at the database where we save those metric definitions to know how to do all of that, right? And so if we're using an LLM to parse out a plain text question, we're looking at all that business context that you provided. And then there's the batch processes, which is every day or a couple of times a day. That's when we're doing like automated analytics. We're going in, we're looking at those metrics. We're saying, okay, let's find the trends. Let's run some of that through an LLM. Let's throw that through like a deterministic algorithm. Let's run that through some forecasting algorithms. Store all that information in the database so that when you go to a dashboard and you want to look at a forecast or look at analysis, you're seeing those results. But again, it's all flowing through the business logic that you provided. And that's really key. And that's certainly part of what we have in mind for the future of Zetta. We can make the process of defining those metrics easier. We can look at your warehouse. We can kind of start to infer what the metrics are. But we're always going to have that point of a human saying, yes, I care about this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
You can even unleash the machine and have it do everything automatically, but at some point you're going to want to review that and have that conversation. And that element is always going to be retained, I think, and is really the key to all of it.
Yeah, that was where I was going because I think, you're talking about working with startups or someone with one analyst. Yes, the data could already be messy for smaller companies or a mid-market company with one data analyst, but it's not going to be a shit show like it is for maybe like a true mid-market company with a data analytics team. And sometimes I feel like that's the biggest hurdle. Like it's getting the data in a unified fashion, structured fashion to be able to do this. So I'm glad to hear that is kind of like the next problem, maybe not the
Right.
immediate next, but the next big problem you guys are thinking about solving.
Yeah. I think there's two facets to that. I think one problem is, let's say you have structured data in your warehouse, but you don't know how to define metrics, which that's where someone like I come in as a consultant and I sit down and I say, okay, this is what you should do. Great. Can we streamline that process a little bit? But you're also touching on data engineering, data modeling, right? Which a lot of companies starting out, this is again something that they need to hire data analysts, data engineers to do. It's just it's data from ads, it's data from their application database, it's event data, it's revenue data. It needs to be structured because, frankly, an underlying assumption here was that it's structured well enough that you can define all those metrics and it will actually execute and return something meaningful. And I know that's like probably the next big problem for people to try and automate a little bit more is data engineering. I think that fits really nicely into the Zetta platform because you can punch in your data warehouse, we can see all the tables, we can build those data models for you, but we're not there yet, right? That's the big problem to solve is, okay, how do we actually do what we're doing on less structured data? I don't want to say unstructured data, I'll say less structured data. The more you can bridge that gap, I think right now, and the reason why I mentioned before, when we talk to companies that have no data practice, we're saying, hey, what's coming? We're going to have to help you set up a data warehouse, get structured data models in place, bridge that gap a little bit. That's all manual effort. It's a one-time cost with some maintenance for the most part, but it is the missing piece to really mostly automating the analytics is getting the data modeling figured out.
It's like the barrier for your product to be able to help companies potentially as you move up market.
I think you're right. It is a problem, but it's also a problem for the analysts. They can't get an answer straight either, right? Like if that's not really put together in the structure.
Yeah, it's work that's being done already. I think our product right now, it's not automating all the work an analyst does. It's automating a lot of the BI. It's automating the metrics development. We do want to eventually automate data modeling if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm assuming you also provide some insights on top of those charts and graphs. I'd love to learn a little bit more about what those insights look like and how you're really allowing them to be actionable for each individual business.
Well, let's pop back into the demo.
Yeah, love it.
Once you define a metric, then we know what that time series is, but we can also see, is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What do you need to know about it? So this is what you might see if you log into Zetta and look at your front page. You can toggle this between different comparisons. Sometimes you want to see week over week, month over month. And this is going to show you kind of the biggest movers of all the metrics that you've defined. So they're all displayed. This is that demo account where we have a ton of different metrics. But the really fun thing here is the dimensional analysis. So this is really based on my experience as an analyst when I come in on a Monday and signups were down last week. People want to know why, right? And the first thing I do is I start toggling between all the different dimensions that we have in our dashboards or in our warehouse and try to find like what's the one segment that really explains that. So you can see here, like this is actually how our automated analysis kind of works is we look at all those dimensions for you so you don't have to do that process of trial and error, right? Here you can see mobile devices and users from the US contributed to an increase. You can also see what might have offset that. That really short circuits that process of figuring out what meaningfully changed among all those segments. Depending on how your metrics are set up, you might have formula metrics that makes it easier for us to also look at related metrics. So if activated signups goes up, is that just because you had a bunch more signups? Now, in terms of, is it actionable or not, right? Like, I think you can't oversell it because at a certain point, we can't necessarily tell you what options your business has, what you can do, right? I think this is, again, the idea is kind of just to automate most of what an analyst does when they're navigating data to get you to that next step where you can say, okay, well, this is why it happened. Okay, what are we going to do now? Is the idea.
I've been at this same company for 5 years. We've had so many versions of the monthly metrics meeting. And what has always been missing is something like this. Because what we do is we have the numbers and then we debate why did that go up? Why did that go
Theories
down?
and
And this is what makes it actionable because now it's like, hey, here's an insight about why that number went up or down or why it stayed the same and what went up and down within it. And then you can actually start to have an actionable conversation, which is, okay, well, let's dig into what's happening there. How do we get more mobile users or how do we do XYZ? And like, let's go focus our energy on that instead. So this is a game changer, yes, on the week to week level, but also at the executive reporting level and leadership.
I think it's a very helpful. And I know you said that you can't make recommendations around the actions, but I think it's a moment when the metric as a measurement function is augmenting into educational function. Because if you really understand the underlying dimensions behind the metric, you can make this actionable.
right.
And transparency is a key here. But I think you also need to have a willingness on the audience to understand and dive a little bit deeper into these definitions, right? That's why it's important that when you're building the framework around metrics, you want to limit the volume of metrics to those that really matter to you and your organization, right? Because if you have too much, I mean, you almost don't know what to follow, right? You can measure these things, that's okay, but you're going to follow only a few. And those few will become the core element of your organizational focus. And the more transparency you have around that, the more action you're going to have around this too as well, right? So you go deeper into this educational element of the metric, and we're often forgetting about that dimension. So, to your earlier point, you still can't make this actionable if you really spend enough time understanding it.
Right. Well, I think that to your point, like a really good metric is something that corresponds to a business lever, that corresponds to something that is ideally inherently actionable, right? Where you know what discussion is you need to have. And yeah, I think to echo what Lizzie said, if you spend less time in those metrics reviews arguing over discrepancies, arguing over where data came from, arguing over why something happened and what segment is responsible, then hopefully you have the space to have those conversations.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, I see there's a lot of description here, right? So I see a lot of reluctant users to switch to anything that is the auto-generated type of insight. The main concern these individuals have is that a lot of times the AI hallucinates.
Right.
How do you mitigate that risk with your platform?
Yeah, I mean, the main way we mitigate it is by running everything through the metrics that you've already defined, right? And so to be blunt, we're narrowing the focus of what the LLM is even doing because it's really just choosing among the metrics that you've already defined. When you ask a question, it's choosing among dimensions, it's accessing the description so that it knows a little bit more context. But the key thing here is it can give you the wrong answer. It can pick the wrong metric, but you're going to know if it picks the wrong metric. One, because it'll tell you if you ask for active users and it'll give you activated signups, right? You'll know right away because we tell it, repeat what you picked so that people know what you've done. It'll be correct internally to what it's chosen, right? It's not making up metrics on the fly. And that was a key consideration for us when we were looking at AI data analysts and what people were trying to do with that. It's like, I don't want an AI data analyst that makes up a metric when I ask it a question, because I need it to reflect that shared reality that we have, that intent that we have. Maybe that's a different AI analyst that brainstorms metrics for you, and that's a brainstorming function. But once I've decided and I'm asking it a question, I don't want it to go off piste on that, right? I want it to answer according to what I've already kind of defined. And that, again, it's a limiting of scope. It's a little blunt in that regard, but it also makes us pretty hallucination proof as long as you're willing to accept that it might give you the wrong metric and tell you the wrong metric, but you know that it shows wrong, and you're not, it's hallucinated in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's a smart way to think about it as like the human needs to be deterministic, the AI cannot. So you can have a product that makes suggestions that the human then makes deterministic that can then go into what you have today.
Well, think about it. If you had a human data analyst and you asked, tell me what weekly active users were last month, and they interpreted that as, I'm going to go into a deep dive of redefining weekly active users and come up with a new thing. That's probably not what you intended them to do. You probably have a certain idea of what that means with what someone mentioned at a meeting last week, and you want that, right? But you might also go to the analyst and say, hey, I'm not happy with our weekly active users definition. Come up with a new definition. That would be a totally different task, right?
Yeah, with using AI more and more, I do it a lot for like content generation, for example, and I don't just copy what's in the content generation and say, yeah, this is good. I read through it and add my human lens to correct things or say, oh, I don't think this is what we want to talk about. And I refine it and so forth. And then if I send that email, I have been the deterministic decider on what has entered that email. And it's the same with data. That's kind of how you're approaching that. And it's just an acumen that, especially in the tech industry where we're adopting a lot of AI, like we have to get better and better about you can trust AI in certain situations. This AI is just coming up with insights based on a set of data you've already defined.
And it's kind of depending on how old you are, like when search engines, I was young and in school, search engines were around and they had to teach you Google something, you have to think critically about the results, right? The thing I don't love about LLMs is that they don't always give you that context. And so that's why the hallucinations are so bad. It's so confident. It just makes some crap up. Whereas if you Google something and you get a conspiracy theory website as the first result, you click through, you're like, all right, I'm seeing this in its original context and I kind of understand whether or not to trust it. And so at Zetta, at least, that's kind of describes our approach, is like, show your work a little bit here. And it's still pointing back to something that you decided what was the context was originally.
Thanks for making us feel old that search engines were around in your
They were
school.
They were new enough that they had to warn us about that.
Hey, I still remember Alta Vista. Do you remember that?
That's a little bit before my time.
Don't. Yeah. It's on the cusp of my time, Demetrius. Don't make yourself look too bad here.
It's somewhere in the software museum. I get it. Hey, I have a question for you, switching gears a little bit towards the startups. I know you were a startup, so you of course you're facing the typical, resource limitation and budget limitations, right? So all these constraints are very well known to you, but there's a lot of other startups that are trying to figure out how to set up the analytics, in their own organization, right? They are not maybe as, data savvy as you are. So what would be your recommendation, right? From your perspective, to establish something that is robust enough without overstretching them from the resource perspective?
Yeah. Well, I think, the number one constraint on these companies to adopt analytics is always just going to be labor cost. The infrastructure, especially these days, infrastructure doesn't cost a lot. If someone is telling you a data practice is going to cost you thousands of dollars a month in infrastructure costs, that's simply not true. It's going to be pretty cheap, hundreds at most. But you need good talent. You need experts to come in and implement it. And so that makes it a very difficult decision to make that investment, to be frank. So when I think about the companies that we're helping, there's one, are you investing in kind of setting up data infrastructure, setting up a warehouse, setting up data ingestion, doing all this data modeling? Are you going to have to pay someone a lot of money to go in and do that? And then two, are you going to be able to maintain that with a lean enough team over time? I think the long-term problem is easier to solve because you say, hey, listen, if you set things up the right way, you're going to save yourself a lot of work down the line. Because again, thinking about, is that a use case that we outlined, having one analyst who can do the job of three analysts and not have a huge amount of tech debt, that's going to save you from those costs ballooning. But I think the fixed startup costs is still really hard to navigate. That gets people kind of into a trap where they don't want to make that initial investment, but then eventually it becomes too late and they really need something fast for analytics. And it's a little bit frustrating for us because we're trying to get in front of people and say, hey, for a modest amount, you can invest in this infrastructure, you can get it started the right way. But on the other hand, I think that's very rational for them to say, hey, listen, Google Sheets is good enough for our reporting now. Even a couple $1,000s a month to get started, it's really just not in the cards. If there's one piece of advice to get around that, I would say like limiting scope of your analytics is really helpful, especially even just saying, hey, revenue analytics is probably the most important thing. We're just going to worry about that. And that means if you want to pull, so you have a lot less to deal with in terms of ingesting that data. You still probably want someone who knows what they're doing to come in and structure it, but you can stagger that investment a little bit is kind of one thing that comes to mind. I mean, the only other thing I can say is that you got to play the long game with this. You got to really think ahead and say, hey, listen, an investment now can save you a lot of hassle down the road. And sometimes it takes people who have already started a company and have already gone through the entire process to kind of understand that. They have to have already failed to know, hey, actually, this is a good thing to get out of.
AI is really showcasing how important it is. If your company has been around for 15 years and all these AI tools are coming out, well, half you can't use because you don't have structured data or the right foundation to build upon. Junk in is junk out. And so I think that's really highlighting the
Yeah.
need to think about this in the early days when it's a lot easier.
And I think there's a certain intellectual tech debt that maybe is a little bit more subtle, but a lot of times when I come in to a company that's already done like one iteration of a metrics definition exercise, you're actually constantly playing catch up to look back and remind people, okay, you used to define it this way. Now we're defining it this way, but on this dashboard, you can still see them in parallel. And there's the technical debt aspect, but there's the intellectual debt of trying to shift people's mindsets. And so it's almost like, children have higher brain plasticity. The organization has a higher intellectual plasticity at an early age to come in and say, these are the key metrics. We're going to start thinking about them early on. And then, of course, you avoid tech debt as well.
And drill that definition into the culture,
Socialize it,
essentially.
really.
Yeah.
And that's another way to avoid siloing is that people, siloing happens over time as organizations grow. So the more disciplined you are in the early days when everyone's kind of a little bit more tight with each other, the more smooth those sort of cross-functional interactions are later on.
Yeah, I think I'm finding two other components that are usually inhibiting the companies to be effective in establishing and evolving the metrics. So the one is the leaders are trying to keep things silo because they avoiding any vulnerable situations where they can just expose themselves and just do criticism.
Yep.
And those who are actually providing the critical opinion and feedback, they also need to realize this is not just a buying a spree moment that where you can just throw anything and whatever because I want to sound smart. But you also need to start thinking when you open your mouth, you have something to say about that metric instead of in my previous company, we've done this. I mean, by the way, when somebody starts the sentence like this,
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
already switching off or I'm trying to put the half Nelson on their neck. It's literally that reaction. So it's something that the leadership needs to understand. I think it goes really deep into the culture of how you, as a leader of these organizations, you defining these interactions between the leaders and groups and how you creating the room for these conversations. There should be element of conflict And that's really something that these people are avoiding. I think they'll have to be clear that at some point somebody will make a decision, but you should be open to that. And that's part of the giving feedback as well. So it's a very important thing, because once all these things are just somewhere in a conversation, I think it's easier to create a culture that like you said, right, where people are not playing this catch-up game. They're really looking for the information, looking for the latest version, because they have a vested interest and they know that their feedback is valuable and is adding something. So this is a long explanation on my end how I approach this, because I see this every single day. I have customers that are facing the same problem. They can grow the business to 20, 40, 50 million in revenue, and they still haven't defined what the ARR is or
Yeah.
ACV is, and so on.
Well, it's creating like an analytical culture versus an operational culture.
Yes.
Everyone operational, that's the easier part. That's how you get siloing, because that's just you're defining who makes the decisions, who runs what, who owns what. But an analytical culture, and that's where a data analytics team is supposed to be helping out with, is where you're actually willing to have those conversations and debates and think about what it all means, and not about just what you're getting done. And some people, they see, especially with these legacy analytics implementations, they see analytics through an operational lens. They see it as a thing to get done. I need to have metrics. I need to be able to talk about them in my weekly board meeting, but we're not actually going to have an intellectual, analytical conversation about them. I think everything kind of that we're trying to do here is simplifying all the processes, incentivizing more thoughtful metric definitions, so that you can't really get away with that. You have to start building that analytical culture.
I wanted to quickly touch on where you see the market heading. We've talked a little bit about tech debt. We've talked a ton about AI. There's all of these AI tools coming out, kind of proliferating the space of options you have around analytics tools. What do you think is going to happen? Are companies going to start consolidating the number of analytics tools they have, or will they have very specialized niche solutions for different parts of the analytic tech stack?
It's interesting. There is a lot of consolidation in the market right now. I don't think it has anything to do with AI. I think it has probably just interest rates. It's the cycle. AI is it's attributed to AI, even though that's not true. So you see like the Snowflakes of the world, the Googles of the world saying, hey, where you used to have maybe 4 or 5 modular data stack components that you implemented, now you can do a lot of those things within the same tool: data ingestion, data transformation. That, I think, is going to continue. I think it's also, those are the same companies who are going to try and cram their AI features into those products. I don't see that reversing necessarily, which is a little bit troubling for someone like me who kind of like cut his teeth in the modular data stack world. And I like that world. And I don't necessarily like the consolidated world. But I can see a little bit of a revolt on the horizon, just because the pricing is probably going to get out of hand
Yep.
when they consolidate it into one tool, and it's an oligopoly. Oh, you already see it with like kind of like Fivetran is notorious as a data ingestion tool for being really expensive. They bought Census, which is a reverse ETL, so that people's bills are probably going to end up getting crazy. They're going to find out those AI tools are not as impressive, or not worth paying for, or not worth justifying the price increases. I don't know. If I knew exactly where the market was headed, I would be retired already. But I can, at least from my perspective, say it's probably going to push people to self-host a little bit more. A lot of the data stack is already open source.
Yep.
Right? That's the truth of it. And like, this company is one of my first times really just doing everything end to end in the cloud or a GCP shop. I should put that in a different category. When you can build an entire application with Google, that was already true. That's a little bit different than like the Snowflakes of the world consolidating things. I think, to get to the other part of your question, like what about these sort of niche, sort of vibe coded micro SaaS, whatever you want to call it? I don't see that really necessarily replacing the core data stack. I mean, I think you're still going to have your DBTs and your BigQueries and whatnot. But I think at the analytics end, that's a really interesting thing that might start to affect the market, is analytics tools that are more niche for a given vertical or industry. To all these conversations we've had around defining metrics, having the right metrics, if you're in an industry where every company should have the same metrics, there could be a tool that, and this is kind of like at Zeta, we've dabbled in this. We have a revenue analytics module for subscription analytics, right? You could have like a really niche tool that does all the right analytics for you, but it's still hard to generalize even within one vertical. I'm a little skeptical that that's going to take off, but I see the potential for it, that someone who just really knows an industry and really is good at data can make a tool that will, for the 10 companies in that vertical, does exactly what they need to do, because it's easier to code and deploy that sort of thing these days.
Or a company like you will go and partner with those tools that knows something really specific
Yeah,
about
I
it
mean, like I said,
industry.
we dabbled in this sort of thing, and that's something that we're open to as we bring on more clients to say, hey, if we see these commonalities, it's called a module for a reason, right? We can make a ton of revenue at like different modules for different businesses.
Yep.
But, I think our experience so far is that you still have to kind of tweak and customize those modules. Like, I'll give an example of like Stripe. A lot of people use Stripe. The same data always comes out of it, but if you are a Stripe practitioner, and this is my first time being like an actual Stripe user, there's so many different ways you can set it up. You can make mistakes. It gets really complicated really fast. And so even for like two businesses that are subscription SaaS businesses, they might be using Stripe in a totally different way. That means that you have to model the data coming out in a different way. And it makes that harder than you would initially think.
That makes sense. The last thing I have before we go to the fun part of kudos is obviously people are very worried about data security anytime they're putting their data in any platform. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit about how Zeta has handled ensuring data is compliant and secure for your customers.
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing that we do is if you're connecting like a data warehouse or a database, we're not storing data. We're just storing the metadata that you use to then execute those queries. And then, if you were to partner with us and wanted to implement a data warehouse for you or manage a data warehouse for you, like, we're going to use existing technologies for that have pretty strong security. So that at least is how I sleep at night, is knowing that modern cloud computing is pretty rock
Secure.
solid, and that we're not going to grab your data and put your data in another warehouse for you, unless you ask us to do that, in which case, that's another discussion. But that keeps it pretty secure end to end.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And it's pretty easy for anyone to wrap their heads around, even if they're not in the know on the data side. Okay, so tell us about two other companies that you're really excited about what they're doing. It can be related to analytics or tools you're using
Sure.
internally.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't say we have a super deep stack internally, but I think in the analytics world, some stuff that I'm seeing, I know DuckTV is getting really popular. And so like MotherDuck is the company that runs them. I've been really keen to follow what they're doing, just because like you think there's kind of not a lot of room for innovation in data warehousing. Like, I love BigQuery, I love Snowflake. They're very feature complete. And when they add new features, they're almost like is redundant, doesn't matter. But DuckDB is really different. It's this in-memory database that they now have created a cloud warehouse around. So it's exciting to see that, to see actual innovation. It's something that you didn't really expect to see innovation
Yep.
around. I also, this is kind of like a silly answer, but I mentioned like it's my first time building a project end to end, and like going all in with Google and GCP on a data stack has been honestly really great. I think they've actually done, not that they need me to give them kudos, but I would say anyone who's starting a data project from scratch, if you buy into that ecosystem, there's pros and cons to it. I've been really surprised, even like setting up Zetta's internal analytics. Like, I've had to jump through very few hoops to do things that 5 years ago would have taken a lot more time and money. So I'm pretty happy about that.
Yeah, Google never needs help. Well, they might actually need more help than ever right now, but yeah, they've come in hard after AWS, and it's been interesting to
Yeah, we looked
see.
at AWS and decided, you know what, actually Google's kind of gotten ahead of them on the data stuff.
Yep. Well, that's great. And so, last but not least, what are the top 3 tips that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I think honestly, we went pretty deep on metric definitions and good metric practices. And so, like, I would love to put a bow on that and say, like, if you're a founder of a startup and you need to decide what your key metrics are, what are the top tips for that? One, obviously start early, make sure that you're keeping it lean, that you're only, defining like a handful, you're defining the bare minimum, right? And that you're working backwards and you're building the bare minimum of data infrastructure to support that. And then I think my number one, it's pretty general, but if you're an end user or an analyst, just say no to making new dashboards. make as few dashboards as possible. That'll save you so much of a hassle in the long run, both intellectually, like intellectual debt, as well as tech debt. If there's one sort of BI principle that's guiding Zetta, it's how can you minimize the number of these dashboards that you're maintaining, because it's always about the metrics. It's never about the dashboards. If you just have that written by your computer as an analyst, that's really going to guide your work, in my opinion.
I love that. Those are great tips. Well, Tyler, thank you so much. I always enjoy watching Demetrius nerd out about data, and you've shared so much great knowledge with us. So thanks for coming on.
It was great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.